Over the years, the meaning of the word sex has changed and broadened. Originally, sex meant simply the categories of male or female based on anatomical characteristics, and this meaning still persists in situations like those when you fill out a form that asks if you are male or female. There are, however, some intersex people. These are people whose sexual anatomy is ambiguous or intermediate between male and female, and for whom that question poses a dilemma. For most of us, our sex is an obvious biological given. It's a reference point on which everything else depends. Starting in the 18th century, the 1700s, the meaning of the word sex gradually broadened. By the late 19th century, it was applied to the whole topic of genital anatomy and function. And by the mid-20th century, sex was also used to mean sexual attraction and sexual behavior. In other words, the word referred no longer just to a category, as in whether you were male or female, but also to a phenomenon and a process. People were now said to have sex when earlier they copulated. They engaged in sexual intercourse, or they made love instead of copulation or fornication. These terms don't agree about what having sex means, but they do agree that it means getting together for a sexual purpose. Words or phrases like sexiness, sex-crazed, sex education, or sex therapy have become commonplace. Most of them relate to sexual attraction and or behavior, and not to the categories of whether one is male or female. As sex came to include sexual behavior, for some it became a bit of a dirty word. Toward the end of the 20th century, therefore, there was a trend toward using another word, the word gender, to substitute for the word sex in its original meaning, which was, of course, the categories of male and female. Both academics and lay people began to use phrases like persons of either gender as an alternative to persons of either sex. In sex research, psychology, and sociology, gender has a somewhat different meaning, however. It refers to the collection of cognitive, behavioral, and personality traits that differ to a greater or lesser extent between the sexes. And your book uses gender in this way. The nature of gender differences and how they arise is an important and controversial theme in human sexuality, and one that we will address in class, both as part of the lecture and in your discussions. Sex is also about relationships. Most sexual behavior obviously takes place within the context of relationships. Not all of these are relationships, however, if you look at things like masturbation, because obviously in most cases one person is involved in that. But there may be an imagined partner about whom the individual engaged in masturbation is fantasizing. Sexual relationships are central to many, and perhaps most people's lives, and there are several general points that one can make about sexual relationships being central to many people's lives. Sexual relationships are diverse. They may last a few minutes or for several decades. They may be motivated by physical attraction, emotional bonding, a sense of duty, a desire to be a parent, a desire to either conform or rebel, or to economic factors. They may be mutually fulfilling, one-sided, unhappy, or abusive. They may involve very similar or very dissimilar partners. They may involve two individuals or several individuals. They may be centered on sex, or they may have sex as a mere incidental feature. They may be recognized and approved by society, or they may be hidden, disapproved, or illegal. Sometimes relationships that the outside world assumes to be sexual aren't sexual at all. Real-life sexual relationships are not ideal relationships. You never get exactly what you want, so you have to count yourself lucky when you come close. We consciously or unconsciously shop around for the best partner we can get, whether it's for a night or for a lifetime. And when we say best, we're referring to tangible and intangible qualities that influence our desires. The net result is a matching that confers varying degrees of satisfaction. There's almost always some degree of a mismatch or conflict that will test the partner's adaptability and communication skills. When sexual relationships are challenged by interpersonal difficulties or by external events, some of those relationships will endure and some will fall apart. This is quite obvious from the statistics that now exist relative to the number of marriages that end in a divorce. Divorce will now account for the end of 50% or more of marriages. One must also keep in mind that sexual behavior and sexual relationships takes place within a moral context. We all have a sense of what is right and wrong, and that sense is influenced by our upbringing, our life experiences, and our religious beliefs or our lack of them, and our ability to reason, or maybe even our genes. People do not share the same moral sensibilities, nor do they necessarily agree on whether a universal code of ethics governs all human behavior and all situations. Sex is also about identity. Psychologically speaking, identity means the sense of who you are. It's often defined in terms of the social groups to which you feel you belong. Sexuality strongly influences people's identity. Most obviously, this is true of people's sense of which sex they are, their gender identity. The great majority of men and women have a gender identity that corresponds to their anatomical sex, but some have a gender identity that is discordant with their anatomical sex, that doesn't match up. These are transgendered or transsexual individuals, and they may seek to change their body habits to match their gender identity. They may even seek to change their sex in order to bring their bodies into harmony with their gender identity. Sexual orientation is another important aspect of identity. Sexual orientation, of course, is the direction of one's sexual attractions. Most people are heterosexuals. They're attracted to the opposite sex. There are socially disadvantaged minorities, however, whose orientations are most conscious of the sexual orientation as an aspect of their identity. These include homosexuals and bisexuals. Homosexuals, often referred to as gay, are people who reach out to one another for sexual fulfillment, their social engagement, and their political action as well, and in the process they establish gay communities. Bisexuals don't need to meet other bisexuals for the purpose of sexual fulfillment, but they may develop a strong sense of identity based in part on their shared experience of prejudice and misunderstanding. Heterosexuality, on the other hand, does not usually confer a strong sense of identity. People take it too much for granted, and consequently they don't use it as a sense of identity. And here's a picture of transgendered men and women protesting on the steps of the Congress, showing that they're proud of their situation, they're proud of their status, and that they vote. Here's a picture of transgendered men and women protesting on the steps of the Congress, showing that they're proud of their situation, they're proud of their status, and that they vote. There are other aspects of people's sexuality that may confer a sense of identity upon them. For instance, people who have group sexual relationships, referred to as polyamorists, swingers, and others who engage in sex outside of lasting relationships. People who engage in sadomasochistic activities, prostitutes, and others whose work involves sex. People who choose to defer sex until marriage. People who sacrifice their sexuality in favor of a lifelong religious vocation. People who have experienced sexual rape or childhood molestation. People who have sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. People with medical conditions or disabilities that affect their sexual expression. And people who do not experience sexual attraction. These individuals are referred to as asexuals. People are likely to have some sense of identity and community with others who are like them. Our sexual feelings, behaviors, and experiences help to establish our place in society, making us sympathetic to those sharing our traits, and less sympathetic, unfortunately, and sometimes hostile to those who do not.